Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Justice is often depicted as a blindfolded figure, holding balanced scales, a symbol of impartiality. But what happens when the blindfold slips? What happens when the scales are tipped not by evidence, but by fear, prejudice, and a desperate rush to judgment? The system, designed to protect the innocent, can become an instrument of their damnation, forging chains of guilt around those who have done no wrong. Tonight, we delve into the shadows of the courtroom, exploring stories of wrongful convictions tales where the search for truth was lost, and innocent lives were shattered by the very system meant to uphold them. Case 1, the Central Park 5 case. The story begins in a city on the edge. New York City, in the spring of 1989, was not the gleaming metropolis of modern postcards. It was a city simmering with tension, a concrete jungle where fear was a palpable currency. The chasm between the rich and the poor, the white and the non-white, was a raw, open wound. Tabloids screamed headlines of rampant crime, and the phrase wilding had entered the public lexicon, a term used to describe marauding wolf packs of teenagers, predominantly black and Hispanic, supposedly terrorizing the city with random, senseless violence. This was the volatile atmosphere into which one of the most profound miscarriages of justice in American history was born. The night of April 19, 1989, was cool and damp. In the northern reaches of Central Park, a place meant to be an oasis for all New Yorkers, a group of roughly 30 teenagers from East Harlem entered the park. They were loud, boisterous, and chaotic, a mix of kids looking for excitement, for trouble, or simply to be part of something. Their actions that night were not harmless. They harassed passersby, threw rocks, and accosted a homeless man. Their behavior was disruptive and criminal, but it would soon be overshadowed by a crime of unimaginable brutality that none of them had committed. Miles away, another New Yorker was in the park for a different reason. Tricia Maley, a 28-year-old investment banker at Salomon Brothers, was an avid runner. A graduate of Wellesley and Yale, she was the embodiment of success and discipline. That evening, after a long day at work, she laced up her running shoes and set out for her customary run through the park's winding paths. It was a routine she had followed many times before, a way to clear her head and push her body. But on this night, her path would intersect with pure, unadulterated savagery. In the pre-dawn hours of April 20th, two men walking through a desolate, wooded ravine off the 102nd Street Transverse Road stumbled upon a scene of pure horror. Lying in a pool of mud and icy water was the battered body of a woman. She was naked, gagged with her own shirt, and her hands were bound behind her back. She had been bludgeoned with a rock and a pipe, raped, and left for dead. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. She had lost over 75% of her blood, and her body temperature had dropped to a dangerously low 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It was Tricia Maley. By all medical logic, she should have been dead. That she was clinging to a fragile thread of life was a miracle. The discovery sent a shockwave through the city. The media, already primed for stories of urban decay and youth violence, seized upon it. The attack on a young, white, successful woman in the city's most iconic park was not just a crime. It was a symbol. It was a violation of a sacred public space and, to many, proof that the city was descending into anarchy, at the mercy of its so-called wilding youth. The New York Police Department was under immense pressure. The mayor, Ed Koch, demanded swift justice. The public, whipped into a frenzy by lurid headlines, bayed for blood. The investigation, from its very inception, was not a measured search for truth, but a frantic hunt for a culprit, any culprit, who fit the pre-written narrative. The police had already rounded up several of the teenagers from the park on the night of the 19th for the other, lesser assaults. Among them were 5 boys: Antron McCray, 15, Kevin Richardson, 14, Yusef Salam, 15, Raymond Santana, 14, and Corey Wise, 16. They were from Harlem, from working-class families. They were not a gang. They were just kids, some of whom barely knew each other. But in the eyes of the police, they were the perfect suspects. They were young, they were black and Hispanic, and they were in the park on the night of the attack. That was enough. What followed was a masterclass in psychological coercion. The boys were taken to various police precincts and separated from one another. For the next 14 to 30 hours, they were subjected to relentless tag-team interrogations by seasoned detectives. They were denied sleep, food, and water. Their parents were either barred from the interrogation rooms or, in some cases, manipulated into encouraging their sons to cooperate. The boys were children, scared and disoriented, plunged into an adult nightmare they couldn't comprehend. The detectives used a classic, insidious technique. They lied. They told each boy that the others had already confessed and implicated him. "Your friend just gave you up," they would say. "He told us you were there. Just tell us what happened, and you can go home." It was a potent fiction. The boys, isolated and exhausted, began to doubt their own innocence. Their desire to escape the suffocating pressure of the interrogation room, to see their parents, to just go home, became overwhelming. Raymond Santana was the first to break. After hours of denial, he finally gave a videotaped statement. It was a confused, rambling account, full of inconsistencies, but it implicated the other four. This statement became the lever used to break the others. One by one, they succumbed. Antron McCrae, whose own father, terrified, told him to just tell the police what they wanted to hear, gave a false confession. Kevin Richardson, weary and frightened, did the same. Yusef Salam, perhaps the most defiant, held out longer. His mother, Sharon Salam, managed to get to the precinct and demand the interrogation stop. But he, too, eventually gave a written, but unsigned statement, crafted more by the detectives than by himself. Corey Wise was not even on the initial list of suspects. He had gone to the precinct voluntarily, simply to support his friend Yusef. But because he was 16, the oldest of the group, he was legally considered an adult. The police decided to question him as well. His interrogation was particularly brutal. He was physically and psychologically battered until he, too, produced a videotaped confession, one that was riddled with factual errors about the crime scene that only someone who wasn't there could make. He claimed the victim had been jogging in shorts when she was wearing pants. He described the attack happening in a different location. But it didn't matter. The police had what they wanted: confessions. The city exploded. The five boys were paraded before the cameras, their faces splashed across every newspaper. They were no longer children. They were a wolf pack. The media narrative was set in stone. Donald Trump, then a real estate mogul, took out full-page ads in 4 major New York newspapers demanding, "Bring back the death penalty. Bring back our police." The presumption of innocence was not just forgotten. It was actively scorned. The boys were tried and convicted in the court of public opinion long before they ever set foot in a real courtroom. The prosecution's case, led by Assistant District Attorney Elizabeth Lederer, rested almost entirely on these coerced confessions. There was no physical evidence to connect any of the 5 boys to the crime scene. The DNA recovered from the semen on Tricia Mayle's sock, the single most crucial piece of forensic evidence, did not match any of the 5 suspects, nor did it match the victim's boyfriend. The hair, fingerprints, and soil samples found at the scene also excluded them. The weapon was never found. The timeline presented by the prosecution was a logistical impossibility, requiring the boys to have been in multiple places at once. The defense attorneys argued vehemently that the confessions were false, products of fear and police manipulation. They highlighted the dozens of inconsistencies between the boys' statements and the established facts of the crime. But in the face of the videotaped confessions, their arguments fell on deaf ears. How could a jury believe that 5 separate individuals would confess to a crime they didn't commit? The very idea seemed preposterous to those who have never experienced the crushing weight of a police interrogation room. The trial was a spectacle, a microcosm of the city's racial and social fractures. In August 1990, McCrae, Santana, and Salam were convicted of rape and assault. A month later, Richardson and Wise were convicted in a separate trial. The courtroom erupted. The boys and their families wept, their cries of anguish and disbelief echoing off the cold marble walls. Their sentences were severe. As minors, Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, and Yusef Salam each received sentences of 5 to 10 years in juvenile detention facilities. Corey Wise, tried as an adult at 16, was given the harshest sentence: 5 to 15 years in an adult prison. He was sent to Rikers Island, one of the most violent penal institutions in the country, a boy in a world of hardened men. The system had delivered its justice. The case was closed. The city, it seemed, could breathe a sigh of relief. For the next decade, the 5 boys, now young men, languished in prison, their lives irrevocably altered. They maintained their innocence, but no one listened. They filed appeals, but they were denied. They became footnotes in New York City history, symbols of a bygone era of urban chaos. Tricia Maley, in an astonishing feat of resilience, had survived. She had no memory of the attack, a condition known as retrograde amnesia. She learned the details of her own assault through news reports. She rebuilt her life, becoming an inspirational speaker, her story a testament to the strength of the human spirit. She, like the rest of the world, believed the right men were behind bars. The truth, however, has a way of clawing its way to the surface, even after being buried for years under layers of lies and injustice. The key to unlocking this case was rotting in a different prison, for different crimes. His name was Matias Reyes. He was a convicted serial rapist and murderer, already serving a life sentence without parole for a string of brutal attacks, including the rape and murder of a pregnant woman. In 2001, in the Great Meadow Correctional Facility in upstate New York, Reyes found himself in proximity to Corey Wise. Perhaps it was a flicker of conscience, or perhaps the simple desire to unburden a soul heavy with guilt. In late 2001, he began confessing to fellow inmates, and then, in January 2002, he approached a corrections officer and formally confessed to the 1989 Central Park jogger attack. At first, authorities were skeptical. Prison confessions are not uncommon. But Reyes's confession was different. He provided details of the crime that were astonishingly accurate, details that had never been made public, details that only the true perpetrator could have known. He described the specific location, the type of weapon he used, a brick, the way he dragged her body into the gully, and the precise nature of the assault. His account perfectly matched the evidence from the crime scene, in stark contrast to the wildly inconsistent and factually incorrect statements of the 5 convicted boys. He stated unequivocally that he had acted alone. He had never met, seen, or known any of the Central Park 5. He was, he said, a predator who had been stalking the park that night, looking for a victim. He saw Tricia Maley jogging and chose her at random. The confession was a bombshell. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, under a new leader, Robert Morgenthau, launched a full-scale reinvestigation. They had one definitive way to verify Reyes's claim: the DNA from the victim's sock, which had been sitting in an evidence locker for 13 years. The sample was tested against Reyes's DNA. The result was a perfect match. The truth was now undeniable, written in the language of science. Matias Reyes was the sole attacker. The Central Park Five were innocent. In December 2002, on the recommendation of the district attorney himself, a state Supreme Court justice formally vacated the convictions of all five men. The motion was not even contested by the prosecution. After more than a decade of wrongful imprisonment, after losing their childhoods, their reputations, and their faith in the world, Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salaam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise were finally officially exonerated. They walked out of the courtroom not as jubilant victors, but as wounded survivors. The years could not be returned. The scars, both physical and psychological, would never fully fade. Corey Wise had spent 13 years in the brutal environment of adult prisons for a crime he didn't commit. The others had lost their formative teenage years. They re-entered a world that had moved on without them, forever marked by a crime that was not their own. In 2003, they filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city of New York for malicious prosecution, racial discrimination, and emotional distress. For more than a decade, the city, under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, fought the lawsuit, refusing to settle, arguing that the police and prosecutors had acted in good faith based on the confessions. It wasn't until 2014, under a new mayoral administration, that the city finally settled the case for $41 million. While a substantial sum, it amounted to roughly $1 million for each year of imprisonment, a paltry compensation for a stolen life. The case of the Central Park Five, now known as the Exonerated Five, is more than just a story of a mistake. It is a searing indictment of a system that failed at every level. It exposes the terrifying power of coerced confessions, particularly from juveniles. It reveals how racial bias and media hysteria can dismantle the presumption of innocence. It is a cautionary tale about the danger of seeking a quick conviction over the hard, patient work of finding the truth. The five men who were once boys, vilified as a wolf pack, have since dedicated their lives to activism and speaking out against the very injustices that consumed their youth. Their story is a permanent and painful reminder that the greatest horror is not always the crime itself, but the possibility that the wrong person can be made to pay for it, their innocence lost in the clamor for a justice that is anything but just. Case 2. The case of Reuben "Hurricane" Carter. The seeds of injustice are often sown in the soil of public fear and prejudice, but sometimes they find fertile ground in the life of a single, polarizing figure. Long before the events that would define his life, Reuben Carter was a man forged in conflict. Born in 1937, he was a product of a troubled youth, spending time in juvenile reformatories and later the military, where he first discovered a sanctioned outlet for his aggression: boxing. He was not a graceful technician in the ring. He was a storm, a relentless force of nature. His shaved head, intense stare, and ferocious, swarming style earned him the nickname Hurricane. By the mid-1960s, he was a top-ranked middleweight contender, a celebrity whose power and defiance made him both a hero to some and a threat to others in an America deeply divided by race. His outspoken nature and his association with black nationalist figures like Malcolm X did little to endear him to the establishment. He was a man who lived his life on his own terms, a stance that would make him an easy target when the winds of fate turned against him. The night of June 17, 1966, was warm and humid in Paterson, New Jersey. Inside the Lafayette Bar and Grill, the late-night quiet was shattered just before 2:30 a.m. Two black men walked in, one armed with a .12 gauge shotgun, the other with a .32 caliber pistol. Without a word, they opened fire. The bartender, James Oliver, and a patron, Fred Cedar Grove Bob Knox, were killed instantly. Another patron, Hazel Tanis, was shot multiple times and would die in the hospital a month later. A fourth victim, Willie Marins, was shot in the head but, miraculously, would survive, though blinded in one eye and with no clear memory of his assailants' faces. The gunman took no money. The cash register was untouched. They turned and walked out as quickly as they had entered, leaving behind a scene of carnage, spent shells, and a lingering question. Why? The Paterson police arrived at a scene of chaos. The motive seemed non-existent, a senseless act of extreme violence. But earlier that same night, another Paterson tavern owner, a black man named Leroy Holloway, had been shot and killed by a white man. In the racially charged atmosphere of 1966, a theory quickly formed in the minds of investigators. This was retaliation, a targeted act of racial revenge. They were looking for two black men, and they needed them fast. The key to the entire case came from two men who were, by chance, in the vicinity of the Lafayette Grill that night. Alfred P. Bello and Arthur Dexter Bradley were not civic-minded citizens. They were petty criminals, and at that moment, they were in the middle of burglarizing a nearby factory. Hearing the gunshots, Bello ran towards the bar. He would later claim he saw two black men getting into a white car and driving away. Bradley, his accomplice, also claimed to have seen them. Their descriptions of the men were vague and inconsistent, but their description of the car a white vehicle stuck. Reuben Hurricane Carter drove a distinctive white Dodge Polara. A few blocks from the crime scene, a police patrol, aware of the shooting and the description of the car, pulled Carter over. In the car with him was 20-year-old John Artis, a young fan whom Carter had just given a lift, and another passenger. The police escorted them to the Lafayette Grill, where the wounded Willie Marins was still awaiting medical transport. He looked at Carter and Artis and stated they were not the men who shot him. Alfred Bello, who was now on the scene talking to police, also saw Carter and confirmed he was not one of the men he saw fleeing. Carter and Artis were questioned at the station, passed polygraph tests, and were released. For a moment, it seemed their brush with the investigation was over. But the pressure to solve this horrific triple murder was immense. The racial revenge theory was too compelling for the prosecution to abandon. And they had two witnesses, Bello and Bradley, who were facing their own legal troubles for the factory burglary. Months went by. The investigation stalled. Then, the police and the Passaic County Prosecutor's Office went back to their star witnesses. Bello and Bradley's stories began to change. Now, their memories were suddenly sharper. They identified Reuben Carter and John Artis as the men they saw leaving the scene. Their previous denials were explained away as fear of getting involved. What the jury would not be told was that both men were offered deals, promises of leniency for their own crimes and reward money in exchange for their testimony. The entire foundation of the state's case was built on the words of two men who were demonstrably unreliable and had a powerful incentive to lie. The prosecution constructed a narrative. They claimed Carter and Artis, enraged by the earlier murder of the black tavern owner, went trolling for white victims to execute. To bolster this, they found two pieces of circumstantial physical evidence. In Carter's car, they found a single live .12 gauge shotgun shell and a live .32 caliber pistol round. The shotgun shell matched the brand used in the murders, though it was a common type. No murder weapons were ever found. No fingerprints at the scene matched Carter or Artis. No blood was found on their clothes or in their car. The state's case rested almost entirely on the shifting, compromised testimony of Bello and Bradley and a motive that was pure speculation. In 1967, Reuben Carter and John Artis went on trial for their lives. The proceedings were tainted from the start. The jury was composed of 10 white and 2 black jurors, but the latter two were dismissed under questionable circumstances, resulting in an all-white jury deciding the fate of 2 black men accused of a racially motivated crime against white victims. The defense pointed out the massive inconsistencies in the eyewitness accounts and the lack of credible evidence. They presented alibis. They highlighted the deals given to the state's star witnesses. But prosecutor Vincent J. Hull, in his closing arguments, painted a terrifying picture of racial warfare, casting Carter as a violent predator. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced both men to 3 concurrent life sentences. John Artis, a young man with a promising future, was destroyed by association. Reuben Carter, the boxing celebrity, was now inmate 45472. In the courtroom, Carter remained defiant, proclaiming his innocence. It was a stance he would maintain with unwavering, almost superhuman resolve for the next 2 decades. In prison, Carter refused to be broken. He rejected the identity of a convict. He would not wear the prison uniform, eat the prison food, or perform prison labor. He considered himself a political prisoner, a man held captive by a racist and corrupt system. He isolated himself, dedicating his time to reading law, philosophy, and history, determined to prove his innocence. In 1974, he published his autobiography, The 16th Round, From Number 1 Contender to 45472. The book was a raw, powerful cry for justice, and it caught the world's attention. Celebrities and activists rallied to his cause. Muhammad Ali spoke at rallies for his freedom. And most famously, Bob Dylan, after visiting Carter in prison, was so moved by his story that he co-wrote and released the iconic protest song Hurricane in 1975. The song, an 8.5-minute epic, laid bare the perceived injustices of the case, turning Carter from a convicted murderer into an international cause célèbre. The lyrics, "Here comes the story of the hurricane, the man the authorities came to blame for something that he never done," became an anthem for a generation. The immense public pressure and new evidence uncovered by investigators working for Carter's defense team had an effect. Alfred Bellow and Arthur Bradley, the state's star witnesses, formally recanted their 1967 trial testimony. In sworn affidavits, they admitted that they had lied on the stand, pressured by the police and enticed by promises of reward money and dropped charges. This was the bombshell the defense had been waiting for. Based on these recantations, the New Jersey Supreme Court overturned Carter and Artis's convictions in March 1976. After nearly a decade behind bars, they were released on bail. Freedom, it seemed, was finally at hand. But the Passaic County Prosecutor's Office was not prepared to admit defeat. They were determined to reconvict Carter and Artis. A second trial was set for late 1976, and the prosecution had a new, more ruthless strategy. Their star witness, Alfred Bellow, who had recanted his testimony, now recanted his recantation. He took the stand and told a new, even more elaborate and damning story. He claimed that his original testimony was true. His recantation was a lie concocted by Carter's investigators, and that he had an even better memory of the crime now. In fact, he now claimed he was inside the Lafayette Grill during the robbery, a detail he had never mentioned before. The new prosecutor, Burrell Ives Hinden, decided to double down on the one thing that had worked before, the motive of racial revenge. Hinden argued that Carter was a racist killer, driven by a hatred of white people. He presented the jury with a theory that was not just speculative but inflammatory, arguing that Carter's Black Power beliefs were evidence of his murderous intent. The defense was caught off guard, forced to defend not just against the facts of the case, but against a character assassination fueled by racial animus. The judge allowed this highly prejudicial line of argument. Once again, despite the lack of physical evidence and the witnesses' wildly shifting stories, the prosecution's appeal to fear and prejudice worked. In December 1976, a jury this time with one black member once again found Reuben Carter and John Artis guilty of the Lafayette Grill murders. The blow was devastating. To have tasted freedom, to have believed the system could correct itself, only to be dragged back into the abyss was a fate crueler than the initial conviction. They were returned to prison to continue serving their life sentences. The hurricane, it seemed, was finally broken. John Artis, a man of quiet dignity and unshakable loyalty, was a model prisoner. He was granted parole in 1981, having served 15 years. He immediately dedicated himself to the ongoing fight to free Rubin Carter. Carter, meanwhile, had lost the support of many of his celebrity backers after the second conviction. The cause seemed hopeless, but a small, dedicated group refused to give up. His legal team, led by attorney Myron Beldock, was joined by a group of Canadian activists who had read Carter's book and become convinced of his innocence. This group, led by Lester Martin, a teenager from a Brooklyn ghetto, moved to New Jersey, formed a commune, and dedicated their lives to working full-time on Carter's case. They exhausted all options in the state courts. Their last hope was to bypass the New Jersey system entirely and take the case to the federal courts, arguing that Carter's constitutional rights had been violated. In 1982, they filed a writ of habeas corpus in federal district court. This legal maneuver asks a federal court to determine if a state's imprisonment of a person is valid. It took 3 years for the case to be heard. On November 7, 1985, their prayers were answered. Judge H. Lee Sarakin of the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey issued a ruling that was not just a legal decision but a thunderous condemnation of the entire prosecution. He overturned Rubin Carter's convictions for the second and final time. Judge Sarakin wrote that the prosecution's case had been predicated upon an appeal to racism rather than reason, and concealment rather than disclosure. He found that the state had violated Carter's right to a fair trial by withholding exculpatory evidence and, most damningly, by arguing a motive of racial revenge that was not supported by any evidence and was intended to inflame the jury's prejudices. The state, he concluded, had essentially manufactured a tale to fit their theory, ignoring the fundamental principles of justice in their unabashed appeal to racial stereotypes. The state prosecutors, desperate to save face, appealed Sarakin's ruling, but the Third Circuit Court of Appeals upheld his decision. They then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. Finally, in February 1988, the Passaic County Prosecutor's Office announced it would not seek a third trial. The case was over. After 19 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, Rubin "Hurricane" Carter was a free man. He emerged not as a bitter, broken man, but as a figure of quiet, profound dignity. He moved to Toronto, Canada, where he became the executive director of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, dedicating the rest of his life to fighting for others who, like him, had been swallowed by a flawed system. He passed away from cancer in 2014, with his loyal friend John Artis by his side. The case of Rubin Carter is a chilling illustration of how a person's identity, their race, their politics, their public persona can be twisted into evidence of guilt. It demonstrates the catastrophic power of prosecutorial misconduct and the willingness of a system, under pressure, to sacrifice one man's liberty for the illusion of order. Carter's decades-long fight was not just a battle for his own freedom. It was a battle against the very idea that justice can be predicated on anything other than reason and fact. His story stands as a permanent monument to the endurance of the human spirit and a solemn warning about the storms that can gather when prejudice is allowed to obscure the truth. Case 3. The West Memphis 3 case. If the story of Rubin Carter was a storm centered on one man, the next case is a maelstrom that swallowed an entire community, turning fear into fact and teenage nonconformity into a motive for murder. It is a story born of a specific time and place. America in the early 1990s, gripped by a nationwide moral panic. It was called the Satanic Panic, a wave of hysteria fueled by daytime talk shows, evangelical preachers, and questionable experts who saw evidence of devil-worshipping cults behind every tragedy. This delusion found its most tragic expression in West Memphis, Arkansas, a struggling, deeply religious Bible Belt town on the banks of the Mississippi River, a place where poverty was endemic and conformity was a shield. It was here, in 1993, that a horrific crime would provide the perfect canvas for a community to paint its darkest fears. On the evening of May 5, 1993, three 8-year-old boys Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers went out to play on their bikes in their working-class neighborhood. They were second graders, friends, inseparable as boys of that age often are. When they didn't return home by dinner, a frantic search began. The entire community turned out, combing the streets and the local woods, their calls echoing into the night. The search continued through the next morning, a gnawing dread settling over the town. On the afternoon of May 6th, the search ended in a muddy, water-filled drainage ditch in a desolate patch of woods known as Robin Hood Hills. A juvenile probation officer, Steve Jones, spotted a small black shoe floating on the murky water. What lay beneath was a scene of unspeakable horror. The bodies of the three boys were submerged in the creek. They had been stripped naked and hogtied, their right ankles bound to their right wrists, their left ankles to their left wrists using their own shoelaces. The bindings were intricate and tight. Their clothing was found nearby, some of it stuffed into the mud of the creek bed. The autopsies would reveal they had died from multiple injuries and drowning. Christopher Byers had been brutally mutilated. The savagery inflicted upon him suggested a personal, frenzied rage. The discovery shattered the small town. The crime was not just a murder. It was a defilement, an act of evil so profound that it seemed to defy rational explanation. The West Memphis Police Department, a small force accustomed to dealing with petty theft and domestic disputes, was completely overwhelmed. They had never seen anything like this. They were under extraordinary pressure to find the monster or monsters responsible. In the absence of experience, they leaned on preconceived notions. The brutal, seemingly ritualistic nature of the murders immediately sparked whispers of a satanic cult. The police, lacking any other leads, seized onto this theory. Their investigation ceased to be a search for evidence and became a hunt for a person who fit the profile of a Satanist in the eyes of a conservative Christian community. They did not have to look far. His name was Damien Echols. At 18 years old, Echols was a known outsider in West Memphis. He was intelligent, articulate, and poor. He dressed in black, listened to heavy metal music like Metallica, and had a fascination with Wicca, a pagan nature religion that the town's residents conflated with devil worship. He was a high school dropout who filled his notebooks with morbid poetry and dark drawings. In a town that valued conformity above all else, Damien Echols was a walking, talking embodiment of teenage rebellion. He was different, and in the panicked atmosphere following the murders, different meant dangerous. He became suspect number one. By association, suspicion fell on his best friend, 17-year-old Jason Baldwin. Baldwin was quieter, more reserved than Echols, but he shared his friend's taste in music and clothing. The police theorized that Echols was the ringleader and Baldwin was his loyal disciple. They now had two members of their supposed cult. They needed a third, and more importantly, they needed a confession. They found their weak link in 16-year-old Jesse Miskelly Jr. Miskelly was known to be acquainted with Echols and Baldwin, though they weren't close friends. Crucially, Miskelly had a documented intellectual disability, with an IQ in the low 70s, bordering on cognitive impairment. He was emotionally immature, highly suggestible, and desperate for approval from authority figures. He was, for the police, the perfect target for interrogation. On June 3, 1993, nearly a month after the murders, police brought Miskelly in for questioning. What followed was a 12-hour ordeal, only 46 minutes of which were recorded. With no parent or lawyer present, Detectives interrogated Miss Kelly relentlessly. He was tired, confused, and intimidated. He consistently denied any knowledge of the crime. But the detectives persisted, using a potent mix of threats and promises. They told him he was facing the electric chair. They told him his friends were blaming him. They suggested he would get a reward and be seen as a hero if he just cooperated. Most insidiously, they fed him details of the crime. The transcript of the interrogation reveals a pattern of leading questions. "What time of day did this happen?" they'd ask. When Miss Kelly guessed wrong, they would correct him. "Was it in the morning or the evening?" "Evening." "That's right." They showed him pictures. They shaped his story for him piece by painful piece. After nearly 12 hours of this psychological battery, an exhausted Jesse Miss Kelly Jr. finally gave them what they wanted: a confession. It was a rambling, incoherent, and factually impossible account. It was riddled with errors that someone present at the crime could never make. He got the time of the attacks wrong, the location of the bodies wrong, and the manner of the assaults wrong. He claimed the boys were molested with sticks, but the autopsies showed no evidence of this. He claimed they attacked the boys in the morning when they were killed in the evening. He claimed Damien Eccles had a knife, but no such knife was ever found. He implicated Eccles and Baldwin, casting them as the leaders of the satanic ritual that he had witnessed. The police had their confession. It was the linchpin of their entire case. Within hours of providing it, Jesse Miss Kelly Jr. recanted, telling his own court-appointed lawyer that the police had scared and confused him into making it all up. It was too late. The narrative was set. The trials of the West Memphis Three, as they were now known, became a modern-day witch hunt. Miss Kelly, because of his confession, was tried separately. His lawyers argued that the confession was coerced and unreliable, but the jury was shown the videotape of a young, seemingly compliant teenager describing a horrific crime. They found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison plus 40 years. The joint trial of Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin, which followed in 1994, descended into a spectacle of moral panic. The prosecution, led by John Fogelman, had no physical evidence linking them to the crime. No blood, no hair, no fingerprints, no murder weapon. Their case was built entirely on Miss Kelly's recanted confession, which could not be used against them directly, but the specter of it hung over the proceedings, and a carefully constructed narrative of satanic ritual abuse. They brought in a so-called occult expert, a man named Dale Griffiths, who testified that the nature of the murders was consistent with cult activity. He interpreted Eccles's interest in Stephen King novels, his black clothing, and his heavy metal music as clear indicators of a satanic mindset. A drawing from Eccles's diary was presented as a satanic symbol. A casual comment Eccles once made to a guidance counselor about drinking blood was twisted into a literal confession. The prosecution argued that the motive was human sacrifice, a blood ritual performed by a teenage cult. They presented testimony from a young woman named Vicky Hutchison, who claimed she had overheard Baldwin and Eccles confessing at a Wiccan meeting, or SBAT. What the jury didn't know was that Hutchison had been threatened by police with having her own child taken away if she didn't cooperate, and she later admitted her entire story was fabricated. The defense was left fighting shadows. They presented evidence that the mutilation of Christopher Byers could have been the result of post-mortem animal predation in the watery ditch. They pointed out the utter lack of physical evidence. They argued that the prosecution's case was based on prejudice against their client's nonconformist lifestyle, not on facts. But in the charged atmosphere of that courtroom, reason stood little chance against fear. The story of a satanic cult was simply more compelling, more satisfyingly evil, than the mundane possibility that the police had the wrong men. The all-white jury deliberated for just a few hours. They found Jason Baldwin guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They found Damien Echols, the supposed ringleader, guilty and sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Echols, then 19, was sent to Arkansas's death row. Jason Baldwin, 17, and Jesse Miskelly, 18, began their life sentences. The case was closed. Justice, West Memphis believed, had been served. For years, the three men languished in prison, their appeals denied by the Arkansas state courts. The story might have ended there, a forgotten local tragedy, were it not for a new form of media that would shine an unforgiving light on the case. In 1996, HBO premiered a documentary by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky called Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. The filmmakers had been given extraordinary access to the families, the lawyers, and the defendants. The film did not offer easy answers, but it laid bare the flimsy nature of the prosecution's case, the overt prejudice of the community, and the shocking lack of evidence. For the first time, a national audience saw the West Memphis Three not as monsters, but as plausible victims of a miscarriage of justice. Paradise Lost ignited a movement. Viewers across the world were outraged. A support network began to form online, one of the first major examples of internet-based activism. A Free the West Memphis Three campaign was born. Musicians like Henry Rollins and Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder, and later, actor Johnny Depp and filmmaker Peter Jackson, became vocal supporters. They held benefit concerts, raised money for a new legal defense fund, and used their fame to keep the case in the public eye. This new legal team, armed with funds and expertise the original defense lawyers never had, began to systematically dismantle the state's case. They hired top forensic experts to re-examine the evidence. The results were stunning. Experts concluded that the knife marks on the victims, particularly the mutilation of Christopher Byers, were not inflicted by a human assailant. Instead, they were consistent with animal predation, most likely from snapping turtles and other scavengers in the creek, occurring after the boys had drowned. The central pillar of the satanic ritual theory crumbled. Perhaps the most significant breakthrough came in 2007 with the advent of advanced DNA testing, a technology unavailable in 1994. The new defense team won the right to test the scant biological material that had been preserved from the crime scene. The results were definitive. Of all the DNA evidence tested, including material from the victims' clothing and the ligatures used to bind them, none of it matched Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, or Jesse Miskelly Jr. However, a single human hair found in one of the knots used to bind Michael Moore was found to be a mitochondrial DNA match to Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one of the victims, Stevie Branch. Another hair found on a tree stump near the bodies was a match to a friend of Hobbs, with whom Hobbs had been on the night the boys disappeared. Terry Hobbs had a history of violence, and his alibi for that night was questionable. He suddenly became a person of immense interest to the defense, though he has always maintained his innocence and has never been charged. Armed with the new forensic evidence and multiple recantations from trial witnesses, including Vicky Hutchison, the defense team filed for a new trial. The state of Arkansas fought them at every turn, refusing to acknowledge the possibility of an error. The case was locked in a legal stalemate. The West Memphis Three had compelling evidence of their innocence, but the state was unwilling to exonerate them, a move that would open them up to massive civil liability and represent a profound institutional embarrassment. Damien Echols, meanwhile, remained on death row, his execution date looming. A solution was needed, a way to end the impasse. In 2011, after 18 years of imprisonment, a bizarre and controversial legal compromise was reached: the Alford plea. An Alford plea is a rare legal maneuver where a defendant maintains their innocence but formally pleads guilty, acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to secure a conviction. It is a guilty plea without an admission of guilt. For the state, it was perfect. They could release the men without ever admitting the original convictions were wrong, shielding them from lawsuits. For the defendants, it was an agonizing choice. Accept the deal and walk free, or refuse, remain in prison, and continue to fight for full exoneration. A fight Eccles might not survive to see the end of From Death Row. On August 19, 2011, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., now men in their mid-30s, stood before a judge in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Their bodies bore the marks of nearly 2 decades in prison. They maintained their innocence but formally entered their Alford pleas. The judge accepted the pleas, resentenced them to time served, and ordered their immediate release. They walked out of the courthouse as free men, but legally, they remain convicted felons. They were free, but they were not exonerated. The case of the West Memphis Three is a harrowing chronicle of how a community's fear, amplified by a flawed investigation and prosecutorial zeal, can create its own reality. It is a story of how a person's taste in music or books can be warped into evidence for a death sentence. To this day, the real killer or killers of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers have never been brought to justice. The case is officially closed, leaving a legacy of 3 stolen childhoods, 3 stolen lives, and an unhealed wound in the heart of American justice. A chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create ourselves. Case 4. The case of Ryan Ferguson. Our final story tonight does not begin with a cult panic or a celebrity target. It begins, as so many tragedies do, on an ordinary night that became extraordinary for all the wrong reasons. It's a story about the fragility of memory, the terrifying power of suggestion, and the unshakable resolve of a father who refused to let the system bury his son. This is a case built not on evidence, but on a dream. It was Halloween night 2001 in Columbia, Missouri. The streets were filled with costumed children and the cheerful chaos of the holiday. At the offices of the Columbia Daily Tribune, Kent Heitholt, the paper's 48-year-old sports editor, was working late, putting the finishing touches on the next day's section. He was a beloved figure, a husband and father known for his professionalism and kindness. Shortly after 2 a.m., he walked out of the building and into the cool autumn air, heading for his car in the near-empty parking lot. It was the last walk he would ever take. A janitor, cleaning the offices, heard noises in the parking lot. He looked out and saw 2 indistinct figures standing near Heitholt's car. He thought little of it, assuming they were college students. A short while later, he went outside and discovered a scene of brutal finality. Kent Heitholt was on the ground beside his car, his face battered, his hands bloodied from a desperate struggle. He had been bludgeoned and then strangled with his own belt. His wallet and car keys were untouched. The police arrived to a puzzling and vicious crime scene. They found a strand of hair on Heitholt's hand, bloody fingerprints on his car, and a bloody footprint on the asphalt. The evidence was collected, witnesses were interviewed, but no leads emerged. For 2 long years, the murder of Kent Heitholt became one of Columbia's most haunting cold cases. The physical evidence led nowhere. The killer, it seemed, had vanished into the night. The key that would ostensibly unlock the case did not come from a police tip or a forensic breakthrough. It came from the fractured mind of a young man named Charles Erickson. In November 2003, 2 years after the murder, Erickson, now 19, was at a party. Fueled by alcohol and Adderall, he began talking about the Heitholt murder. He had a strange, persistent feeling, he told his friends. A memory, like a dream he couldn't shake, that he and his friend, Ryan Ferguson, had been there that night. At the time of the murder, Erickson and Ferguson were 17-year-old high school juniors. They had been out at a bar on Halloween night using fake IDs. Erickson remembered leaving the bar, but the rest of the night was a black hole, a void in his memory he had become obsessed with filling. Over the next few months, this dreamlike memory began to crystallize. Fed by news articles he looked up about the murder and by conversations with friends who, perhaps jokingly, perhaps seriously, encouraged his fragmented recollections. He became convinced that the blank spot in his memory must contain the horrific truth. In March 2004, tormented by a guilt he couldn't be sure was real, Charles Erickson walked into a police station and told detectives he thought he might have been involved in the murder of Kent Heitholt. The police had a suspect walk through their door, confessing to a high-profile cold case. It was a dream scenario for any detective. The interrogation that followed was not a fact-finding mission. It was a process of construction. The recordings of the interrogation are a chilling document of psychological manipulation. Erickson is visibly uncertain, his speech littered with phrases like, "I think," "It's so foggy," and "I could be just fabricating this." He can't recall any of the essential details of the crime. The detectives, however, guide him. They provide the details he lacks, and he incorporates them into his narrative. When Erickson says he remembers hitting Heitholt with a tire tool, a detail that matches the autopsy report, it seems like a breakthrough. But investigators later determined that this detail had been published in the newspaper. Erickson, in his obsession, had read the articles. He wasn't recalling a memory. He was regurgitating a fact he had learned. The detectives ask him who he was with. Erickson names his friend from that night, Ryan Ferguson. He paints a picture of the two of them, desperate for more money for drinks, deciding to rob someone in the parking lot. The robbery went wrong, he claims, and Ryan Ferguson strangled Kent Heitholt with his own belt. The police now had a confession and two names. They arrested both Charles Erickson and Ryan Ferguson. Ryan, now 19 and a college student, was bewildered. He had no memory of any such event because, as he insisted from the very beginning, it had never happened. He remembered being at the bar with Erickson, and he remembered his friend dropping him off at home. That was it. But his denials meant nothing in the face of Erickson's confession. The prosecution, led by a charismatic and ambitious prosecutor named Kevin Crane, knew that Erickson's dream-based, self-admittedly foggy testimony might not be enough. They needed corroboration. They went back to the only other known witness from that night, the janitor Jerry Trump. In his initial statement in 2001, Trump had told police he saw two young white men, but he could not identify them and his description was vague. Now, in 2004, the police showed him a photo lineup that included Ryan Ferguson. At first, Trump couldn't identify anyone. But after being prompted by police and later meeting with prosecutor Kevin Crane, his memory suddenly, miraculously sharpened. He now claimed that he recognized Ryan Ferguson. He said he remembered looking Ferguson dead in the eye that night. The state's case was complete. It rested on two pillars. The first was the testimony of Charles Erickson, a troubled young man who admitted his memory was a dream, who had a history of substance abuse, and whose story was riddled with inconsistencies. The second was the testimony of Jerry Trump, an eyewitness whose memory conveniently became crystal clear 2.5 years after the event. There was no physical evidence. The hair found on Kent Heitholt's hand did not match Ferguson or Erickson. The bloody fingerprints on the car did not match Ferguson or Erickson. The bloody footprint did not match Ferguson or Erickson. The case against Ryan Ferguson was made of words, and nothing more. Faced with the death penalty, Charles Erickson accepted a plea deal. He would plead guilty to second-degree murder and receive a 25-year sentence in exchange for his testimony against Ryan Ferguson. In the fall of 2005, Ryan Ferguson, who refused any plea deal, went on trial for first-degree murder. The trial was a masterclass in prosecutorial storytelling. Kevin Crane presented Erickson as a young man haunted by his conscience, finally coming forward to tell the truth. He presented Jerry Trump as a solid, reliable citizen whose memory was jogged by seeing the defendant's face again. The defense, led by attorney Charlie James, hammered on the complete lack of physical evidence. They pointed out that every piece of forensic material collected at the scene excluded his client. He attacked the credibility of Erickson, showing the jury portions of his interrogation where he admitted he could be fabricating the story. He questioned how Trump's memory could so drastically improve over time, a phenomenon that runs contrary to all scientific understanding of memory. But the narrative was too powerful. Erickson's detailed, albeit fed, account of the crime was compelling. Trump's confident finger-pointing from the witness stand was damning. The jury, faced with a choice between a story with no physical proof and the seemingly unbelievable alternative that two separate people would lie and send an innocent man to prison, chose the story. They found Ryan Ferguson guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. At 21 years old, his life was, for all intents and purposes, over. As Ryan was led away in chains, his father, Bill Ferguson, made a vow. He would not rest until his son was free. He refused to accept the verdict. He knew his son was innocent, and he would prove it. Bill Ferguson, a real estate developer with no legal or investigative training, transformed himself into a one-man army for justice. He poured his life savings, hundreds of thousands of dollars, into his son's defense. He spent every waking hour poring over police reports, trial transcripts, and evidence logs. He taught himself investigative techniques, bought recording equipment, and began a relentless quest to uncover the truth. His investigation was a slow, agonizing process of chipping away at the state's case. He tracked down the kids who had been at the party where Erickson first mentioned his dream, getting them to admit on tape that Erickson had no solid memory of the event. He re-interviewed everyone connected to the case, methodically searching for the cracks. His journey led him to the two men whose testimony had sealed his son's fate. Years passed. In 2012, the case caught the attention of Kathleen Zellner, a renowned post-conviction attorney famous for exonerating the wrongfully convicted. With Zellner's legal powerhouse and Bill Ferguson's groundwork, the pressure on the original witnesses mounted. Finally, the pillars of the state's case began to crumble into dust. First, Jerry Trump, the janitor. Tracked down by Zellner's investigator, Trump, now burdened by years of guilt, confessed. In a sworn affidavit, he recanted his entire trial testimony. He admitted that he had been pressured by prosecutor Kevin Crane. He stated that Crane had intimidated him, suggesting that if he didn't identify Ferguson, he might become a suspect himself. He admitted he had lied on the witness stand. He had never seen Ryan Ferguson's face that night. He didn't know who he saw. The first pillar was gone. Next, Charles Erickson. In prison, Erickson had been tormented by his own testimony. He had sent Ryan to prison, and the certainty he had felt, manufactured in an interrogation room, had long since evaporated, leaving only doubt and guilt. In a series of interviews with Zellner's team and later in a formal court hearing, he too recanted. He admitted that his testimony was a complete fabrication. "I have no memory of the night of the crime," he stated. "It was a dream. I lied." He explained that he was scared, high, and that the police and prosecutor had fed him the information. The second pillar, the very foundation of the state's case, had disintegrated. With both star witnesses recanting, the case against Ryan Ferguson was a hollow shell. But the legal battle was far from over. Lower courts, reluctant to overturn a jury's verdict, denied his appeals. Zellner's team took the fight to the Missouri Western District Court of Appeals, where they made a new, powerful argument. They argued that the prosecution had committed a Brady violation, a serious form of misconduct where the state illegally withholds evidence that is favorable to the defense. They had discovered that Jerry Trump's wife, Shauna, had told prosecutors before the trial that her husband was an unreliable witness who had been drinking that night and whose story had changed over time. She had warned them that he was lying. Prosecutor Kevin Crane knew this. He knew his star eyewitness was compromised. Yet he hid that information from Ryan Ferguson's defense team. He presented Trump to the jury as a credible witness while knowing he was not. This was the final, fatal blow. On November 5, 2013, the Court of Appeals issued its ruling. It was a scathing rebuke of the state's conduct. The court threw out Ryan Ferguson's conviction, stating that he had been denied a fair trial because the prosecution had suppressed crucial evidence. The court concluded that, with the recantations of both key witnesses, there was no evidence whatsoever to even suggest Ryan was involved in the crime. They ordered his immediate release. On November 12, 2013, after spending 3,903 days, nearly 10 years in prison for a murder he did not commit, Ryan Ferguson walked out of the Boone County Courthouse a free man. He was greeted by the embrace of his father, the man whose faith had never wavered, whose relentless fight had moved mountains. His freedom was a testament to a father's love and a warning about a system that was willing to build a man's cage out of nothing more than a dream and a lie. The real killer of Kent Heitholt, whose DNA and fingerprints were left at the scene, has never been identified. Tonight, we have journeyed through 4 landscapes of injustice. We saw how fear can turn boys into a wolf pack, how prejudice can silence a hurricane, how panic can conjure a satanic cult from thin air, and how a lie can grow from a dream. These stories are not just tragic anomalies. They are solemn warnings, etched into the annals of law. They reveal the terrifying fragility of the systems we build to protect us, and how easily they can be corrupted by our most basic human flaws: fear, bias, and the desperate need for a simple answer to a complex evil. Sleep well, and may your dreams be untroubled. Good night.